Hello everyone. Jai Bhim, Johar, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you from whichever part of the world you're joining us. Welcome to the last of the webinars for the year 2021, organized by the International Solidarity for Academic Freedom in India, or in short, INSAF, a collective of diasporic academics and concerned citizens from different parts of the world campaigning for academic freedom in India. My name is Maitri. I'm currently a research master's student of cultural analysis at the University of Amsterdam, and I will be co-moderating today's session titled Caste, COVID and the Public Education System in India, along with Mohit Verma. Mohit, would you like to introduce yourself?
I have completed my master's in economics from Madras School of Economics, Chennai. Currently, I'm working as a research associate at Good Business Lab, and I'm also a co-member in Bahujan Economics. Along with Akram, I was also part of the team that came out with the school report with economist Chandres and Ritika Kheda. So Bahujan Economics is a platform for researchers, scholars, students, and professors belonging to the Bahujan communities in economics to collaborate and support each other, and for allies to extend support to us. So, along with an attempt to increase our representation in research, the group's objective is also to put forward our perspectives that have largely remained absent until now from the discipline. B is a collective that provides support to students of marginalized communities in economics. And yeah, over to Mitri now.
Thank you, Mohit. And thank you for, of course, co-moderating this session with us. Joining us today to shed more light on the topic are two very esteemed panelists. Let me take a moment to introduce them. First, we have Akram Dhalait. I hope I pronounced that right. Akram Dhalait is an independent researcher from Maharashtra, India. He has 3 master's degrees, one clinical psychology, another gender studies, and another in English literature. He also holds a diploma in education, mass communication, and digital humanities. Most recently, Akram was a part of the team that produced the School Children's Online and Offline Learning Survey, or the SCHOOL School Report, with economists Jean Deris, Ritika Khera, Nirali Bakla, and Vipul Paikra. He has conducted various research projects in the rural regions of Maharashtra, including psychosocial research into environmental distress, internet and mental well-being of school children, implementation of governmental policies, and the digital divide. Thank you for joining us, Akram. Next, we have Gunjan Sharma. Gunjan Sharma is a faculty member at the School of Education Studies, Ambedkar University, India, in Delhi. She teaches in the areas of education studies, education policy, teacher education, curriculum studies, child's rights, and action research. Her research and publication focus are on education policy, specifically politics at a school and teacher education levels. Her recent book explores how a state school shapes the aspirations of children in the urban margins in a post-RTE context in India, RTE being Right to Education Act. The work engages with youth and children's everyday experiences as they negotiate the intersecting axes of caste, class, gender, and citizenship in Delhi slums. In 2016-17, she was awarded a Fulbright Nehru postdoctoral fellowship in education policy. She has worked with various government and non-governmental organizations on matters of public policy and served in various capacities on the national level teacher education reforms in India. Thank you so much for joining us, Gunjan. We also had Beena Palekal joining us, but unfortunately she had a last-minute emergency meeting, so she couldn't be here. Nonetheless, I will read out a short bio of Beena because her NCDHR report was very important in understanding the intersection between caste, COVID, and public education in India. So, Beena Palekal is currently General Secretary of Dalit Arthik Adhikar Andolan arm of the National Campaign for Dalit Human Rights, shortened as NCDHR in India. Beena has been with NCDHR for the last 7 years, working on Dalit economic rights with a special focus on Dalit women's economic rights and working towards policy changes within central and state governments for the development of Dalit and Adivasi community and inclusion of Dalit women in policy formulation. Her NCDHR report has been really important while we were trying to come up with the questions for the survey, along with the locked out school the school survey that Mohit and Akram are a part of. Our Shruti, who is also a part of INSAF India, will be posting links to it. These resources are available online, so please go take a look at it. And again, thank you so much, Gunjan and Akram, for joining us and taking the time to be part of this. So, okay, so before we start, a couple of house rules for the audience. So we're doing like a question and answer session with the audience towards the end of the session. So we're not taking any live questions during the course of the session. But if you have any questions that immediately pop up, please do leave them in the chat box, and we will definitely come back to it at the end of the session. And also, if there's any technical difficulties, please feel free to drop them in the chat box and we'll take a look at it. So let's start. So we wanted to kind of start off with like a general overview. We wanted to understand how the push for the implementation of the National Education Policy 2020 accelerated or decelerated a caste-based division in public education, especially in light of how the past 1.5 years of lockdown have progressed. Both Gunjan and Akram, whoever wants to take the floor first, please just shed a little light on just how the past few years have progressed and what it means. Akram, would you like to take that first?
Okay. Am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. First of all, thanks for inviting me here. So as a part of school study research team member, I would like to emphasize some of the key findings of our survey, as well the new education policies. Okay. So as you pointed out, the survey conducted under Ritika Khera and Professor John Reyes. So basically, our main objective of survey is to understanding the impact of online education on marginalized community and marginalized students. So in this survey, I just want to explore some main finding, because it is very related to the new education policies. Okay, so how the in Maharashtra, specific in tribal region, how new education policy and its implementation and the ongoing discourse in Maharashtra. Okay, so I just mentioned the key findings of our survey, because I feel it is important to explain in here. Okay, so in this survey, you Mohit, along with Mohit knows ki, we were interviewed nearly 1,400 households reside urban and rural bastis and mohalla and hamlets. Okay, so our focus is basically on nuclear families. So we collect data from 15 state and union territory. I and my colleagues collected data from Palghar, which is tribal majority district in Maharashtra, and also known for malnutrition and education crisis. Okay. So I need to emphasize the picture that emerged from the survey. In this survey, we find that only 8% rural sample children on studying online, and 37% are not studying at all. So only 9% of all school children had their own smartphones. Okay, so one of the reason for this is that many samples households have no smartphones. So there is problems in decline reading ability in student, like 65% in urban and 77% in rural respectively, decline reading ability, the basic reading ability. So after the announcement of lockdown, primary and upper primary school shut down in across country. We know that some of minority elite sections able to join online classes, online study, but rest of the other section is completely out of this discourse. So our focus is to understand the implications of online education. So I just refer NCD HR data here because it is very important to understand. 51% Dalit and Adivasi students could not access online classes during Corona and lockdown. Okay, which is terrible for everyone. That's because of the unavailability of smartphones and internet access. In our district, now I'm currently living in Palghar, so I can explore the other reports and other our independent research project regarding to education survey. So here we are facing to collecting data to communicate tribal peoples and student and teacher. So most of the teachers is unable to communicate to us because their own privacy reason, job reasons. Okay, so they are not interested to give any information regarding to school or new education policy or what is program implementation in their school. So in Maharashtra, as far as Maharashtra concerned, during this school study survey, we find out the online education in the challenge of online education in SC ST community, and there is I'm just exploring one example. There is a basti called Fanaswadi in Palghar. We visit 30 households, and all households are wage laborers. So their children are also helping them in work. Okay, so there is no idea of education in that region. Okay, so our focus is to understand the different aspect of lockdown and the different impact on lockdown in especially in tribal majority region. So there is totally beyond the margin, what we say ki, the marginalized community is going beyond the margin. Okay, so we are concerning that the online education as well as the new education policies is a challenge to accept, challenge to implement in Palghar in a tribal region, because here is the main challenge for us is language, because in new education policy suggests that we are focusing local language, we are focusing regional language, but here is last 2-3 years we are facing the main issue is language. Okay, so the state government provide the Marathi language, but these people are didn't know the Marathi, they don't know the basic alphabets of Marathi language. So the main concern for a new education policy as far as Palghar district, we faced not only the technological issues, we face the other sociological and sociological issues in the region. Okay, I think okay.
Let me just expand upon what Akram mentioned. So Akram conducted a survey in Palghar, and it was a relatively rural and among the more, you could say among the more marginalized areas in India. But I conducted survey in Jaipur, and wasn't as marginalized as the area Akram went to. But even in urban areas, in places like say Jaipur and even in metropolitan cities, what we found in the survey was that even children in urban areas were struggling, and the problem was more compounded for children belonging to marginalized castes. So, for instance, in Rajasthan, as in other areas as well, children have been making the jump from private schools to government schools because poor parents haven't been able to pay this fee for their schools, right? Even a lot of the people we surveyed, some of them told us that the schools have been asking the private schools that were children were enrolled in earlier. They were asking them for fees, but they were not holding any classes. They were not doing any online classes either. Some of them told us that they would send us a 5 or 10 minute clip a day and a short video, and that was that, and that was all they were doing in the name of conducting classes in schools, and there was no other support from them at all, but they were pressurizing us to pay fees. So we are taking our children out of private schools to now government schools. And the data also speaks for it. In Rajasthan last year, about 8 million children were enrolled in government schools, but this year it increased to 8.8 million. Yeah. And other than that, there has been a huge learning loss in schools. Like almost half of all the children that we surveyed in the survey, or out of the 1.4K children that we surveyed, almost half of them were not able to read beyond a few words. We try to administer them a very small reading test, a very simple sentence like it went something like Corona के कारण school बंद है, चाहते हैं कि जल्दी से जल्दी school खुले, या it went something like that, and half of the children were not able to study beyond a few words. And this includes students from class 1st to class 8th even. There were even some who couldn't read at all, and almost every parent that we talked to told us that there had been a huge learning loss, that their children had forgotten what they had learned earlier, and schools hadn't taken any measures. And even now that schools have reopened, all that's happening in the name of bridging this learning loss is basically either in some states they have been given some books, or they have been given some guidelines, and that's that. Like it's all on paper, nothing's actually happening. Basically, nothing substantial is being carried out to bridge the learning loss that exists. And yeah, some of the teachers are trying in their capacity to hold extra classes or something, but that's like not the norm. That's more like the exception. So right now, what we're facing is a huge learning loss crisis, which state or the central government, none of which seem to be giving any, none of them seem to be caring about it. So right now, yeah, so when it comes to COVID and so they are not doing very well, I would say.
Thank you, Akram and Mohit. I think both of you, given that both of you have worked on the locked out survey, there are a lot of points that you touched upon, like language, like issues with teachers, and a lot of other of those, and like learning lags and things like that, which we will be going into in a lot more depth going ahead into the webinar. Gunjan, do you have anything to add based on your expertise?
Yeah, I think what I'll say here is that while the digital divide has somewhat been studied during the pandemic and even after that, and also the learning loss, what has not really been systematically engaged with is how classrooms have shaped up in this time. While there has been marginalization pushing out of the schools, but the classrooms have also changed quite a lot. And what does it mean to be in an educational institution has totally changed to something else, which we didn't know really could happen, particularly from the perspective of the marginalized kids. And what we have seen is that the central piece of this entire education system, which is relationships, which is connectedness, which is coming together in a school space, that has been taken away. And if one really looks at it, while we have critiqued schools, critiqued higher education institutions for reproducing social inequities and actively marginalizing students from marginalized social groups, what we have not seen is the side that these are also subversive spaces where students, teachers, particularly from Bahujan, Adivasi, LGBTQ plus Dalit communities, they come together and they are able to form political groups. And what has happened over this last 1.5 or almost 2 years is an extreme fragmentation and a disconnect between the student body. So there are groups of students that have not even seen each other all through, who have not even visited the campus once. And now, to bring them back to classes is a major challenge. And I'm saying this from my experience and also from a short project that we are doing at my university with some students, that at the schools and as well as higher education institutions, it's challenging to get women Dalit students to the classes back. is something that we, are getting as an initial finding. So I think, while we do talk about digital divide and loss of learning, I do think that there is too much of learnification also that's going on these days. So, this discourse that, schools are spaces for learning, and learning really literally translates to learning outcomes, which are very measurable, is a very narrow view of education. And schools are actually these very important, relational spaces which have a lot of political potential, especially for marginalized groups, which I feel in my experience has really been the real issue where we need to focus how the last year has went by. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Kunjan. That's actually a very, very important observation, because like part of the NEP is also the economic agenda, right? That the idea of learning being learning outcomes, which is obviously coming out more poignantly in the last 1.5 years. So thank you for that. Let's jump into more detailed questions. We currently want to look at the national education policy specifically in the light of the effects and experiences of COVID-19. So Gunjan, could you please shed some light on the shift from the 10+2 structure to the 5+3+4 structure, and the implication it has for students coming from backward castes that are already coping with socioeconomic oppression and learning lags given the lockdown?
Right. I think, of course, we would have read the policy, so one knows what 5+3+3 means and what is the change that is being suggested. So largely looking at Anganwadi system 3 to 6 years of age with class 1 and 2. And I think there is no basis given for why this structure is being proposed, but I'm assuming that it's based on the age stage model of child development. Because that year, cutoffs match that, theory. But, we need to really think about how these theories are originated from a particular context and what ramifications do they have for other cultural contexts. These theories need to be culturally adapted and looked into. That is one. And the second is that we also need to look at, what the policy is saying in terms of what is the change that it's proposing. It's not saying that the structure will change. It's saying it's a pedagogic and curricular reorganization that is going to take place. Because to change the structure, you would really need to push in a lot of money and a lot of effort to really, get the system going on this model. Now, the second part of it is that we have recently come to an agreement over past, say, 30 to 40 years of educational discourse. After a lot of back and forth debates, there is a certain degree of agreement over, elementary approach to organizing schools being a better modality of looking at education. And, because it looks at classes 1 to 8 at least, if not preschools, in a continuum. And it allows the students to, kind of continue in a particular space, in a particular pedagogic style, and in a particular, with even probably particular kind of people for a relatively longer period of time. And you can do a lot if you look at curriculum at this stage as a spiral and not as, classes model. And this shift has come about from, a system where primary, secondary, and senior secondary systems were being thought of. And now, even at a time when we have not really shifted or kind of understood the elementary model enough, we are proposing another shift. So there are too many shifts, too frequent ones. And what we also need to see here, where the question of caste and also the question of marginality aligns, is the implication of this on the Right to Education Act. This act is based upon an elementary model of schooling, and it is a right to elementary education and not a right to 5+3+3+4, whatever you may want to call it. And the manner in which it has fixed duties, the manner in which it has fixed norms for schools is based on the imagination of elementary schooling as the way forward. And Right to Education Act is not one act by itself. There is a system within which it is located. There is NCF, National Curriculum Framework, NCFT, National Curriculum Framework for Teacher Education, and the reforms for teacher education.
Gunjan, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Could you also shed before we continue, could you also shed a bit of light on what the 5+3+3+4 structure is?
Oh,
Because,
okay. Yeah. So basically, in India, generally, we see that classes 1 to 5 are seen together as primary, and then the classes 6 to 8 sometimes are located even in a different school system. So it varies across India. It's very complicated, but primary is class 1 to 5, and that's one way of looking at it. And then you go to class 6 to 10, which is another level, and then you go to senior secondary. So primary, secondary, and senior secondary is the way you organize the school generally, where primary is still 5, secondary is then 6 to 10, and then senior secondary is 11 and 12. That's the way it is. And then certain policies have suggested that you rather look at this as classes up to 8, and then you go ahead and look at secondary and senior secondary, because that's how generally critical educational scholars have visualized learning and curriculum. This policy is suggesting that you rather look at it as 5+3+3+4, which means that you look at preschool plus classes 1 and 2 as the foundational stage. Then you have a segment of primary of 2 years falling in the next stage, and then you look at upper primary, which is class 6 to 8 as the third level, and then you go above that from classes 9 to 12. Right, so that's the model that they are talking about. So as I said, I don't know what is the basis of it, why are they doing this, but what one sees is the clear need to bring in preschools with schools. That one understands, but how does it kind of go along the Right to Education Act is what I was saying, is the point of entry in where you understand the ramifications for marginalized communities, particularly social caste groups. The act has been framed largely keeping in mind the fact that government schools are in a very bad shape in India, and also the fact that increasingly what you find is that these school systems have gotten an identity of serving Dalits, Adivasi children, so the most marginalized of all, and even within them women children. So you see that mostly Dalit women would be the group that constitutes a major percentage of public school going kids. So how do you look at the question of quality, equity in that context is what Right to Education Act is all about. So now if you make changes which are going to be structural in nature, they will have a ramification, a reverse fallout for the Right to Education Act is what I'm saying. Also, a lot of effort has gone in the past 20 years or so, and only in the last 10 years, 15 years, we were able to see certain things moving. So like, a lot of work on curriculum has been done, a lot of work on textbooks has been done. You may want to check the NCERT textbooks that are currently in place in India. And of course, you can critique them. There are a lot of problems in them, but they do bring in the question of marginalization, caste, class, gender in a very big way in the heart of curriculum. And these questions which were totally outside the curriculum, this is the first time that they are being seen as in the core heart of the classroom space. So we have to see the structure by itself, looking at itself. We can't say that it has ramification for caste, but we'll have to look at it, locate it in a broader picture to be able to see how it's having a ripple effect on other things that have been happening in the system. Yeah.
I actually think I have a follow-up question to that, because like there's a survey called the Political Economy of Public Goods, some evidence from India, which was mentioned in the NCDHR, in which they mentioned that with unequal access to primary schools, that plays a key role in fueling disparities among various caste groups. And I understand the implication that it has on adapting to the RTE, but at the same time, giving that amount of importance to primary education as foundational, will that actually prove good then for these marginalized groups?
See, we will have to really understand why access still remains a question here. Is it really a question of access per se, or does access mean something more than just coming physically to a school? And why are kids out of school? I don't think it's just a question of not having a school around you. Finding meaning in what is happening inside the classroom is probably a bigger reason. Finding a connect with your life world and what goes on in the school, and what aspirations does a school frame itself on. And generally, what I feel from my own research with a primary school in Delhi, it was an ethnography, a year-long ethnography. I've just published it. What I found is that the primary reason why children don't come to school is basically related to, the mismatch between the dreams that the school is posing for them and the dreams that they may actually be able to realize through schooling. So while it's a compulsion, while you have to go to school, but what happens in the school doesn't engage you meaningfully. So even when you are physically there in the school, you are not doing much. And therefore, the need to, rather than going to school, go out. So it's not the way we think it works, it's the other way around. So the school system has never assimilated people from disadvantaged social context. There has been always this view of integrating mainstreaming going on in the policy space, but we have not thought of inclusion. We have not thought of changing the system to be able to make it cater to what people aspire in the margins. So and it's precisely there where I say that we have to go the way we have been thinking from past 20 years, because we have moved ahead a little, at least in terms of coming to some agreements. A lot of work went into making the NCF, the NCFPE, the Justice Verma Commission. It had work put in by Supreme Court. It had work put in by social activists and a host of actors, including consultation with parents and a long experience of school. And when we see the results, probably not even close in the sight, but to some extent you see that there is an agreement. You have another system coming in. And why are you getting it? Probably it seems that the need to do something new is what is leading to all this. So that's my sense of this whole thing. But yes, there are nuances that we can discuss and consider. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you, Gunjan. Moving on to the next question, I think this question could be directed to Akram, because you've already mentioned the issues with language when it comes to NEP. The NEP, of course, recommends the use of home language or mother tongue, and it privileges classical languages such as Sanskrit. Keeping in mind the drop in literacy rate that the locked out survey has made visible for us during the pandemic, do you think this will hurt Bahujan students more, as it prevents them from learning English, which is a very important tool for their economic mobility?
Right. Right. As you point out, because English is now is necessary for your economical and your careeristic point of view. So to focus on home language, which is already is very complicated, because we don't have a textbook in our language. Okay. We in Maharashtra especially, there are at least 40 language in tribal region. Okay, so but our our textbook is majorly published in the own language, Marathi. So the real task on teachers to communicate to student by other moderator. So there is no policy or no alternative function to translate their books in home languages. So already the language, the problem in tribal region. So to focus on home languages and to give less important to other languages, it is very challenging to pursuing student as well teachers, because in primary level I'm talking about especially in tribal and Maharashtra region, because here is no facility to teach English, or there is no trained teacher to teaching English courses. Okay, so here is the idea of education is completely different from the other what we talk currently. Okay, so here is no hope to understand the basic our own language, like a Marathi language. Okay, so in our survey, in school survey, we are looking to the moderator, we are looking to the tribal educated persons who is translate to their opinion, their interview to us, to understand what they are telling to us. So there is multiple aspect to understand the language issue to the specific in tribal region. But one thing is I mention here, because English is important language, so it is need to explore, it is need to create a new policies in specific in region. In new education policy, I think there is no new education policy has been projected to resolve all Indian education problem. Okay, so I think the reality is different from the policy. So like RT, as Gunjan ma'am explained, RT, which is already completely fail in our region. Okay, so there is no hope to teach or to receive the new language, okay, as home language or the English language. Okay, so completely the education is completely different, but we are talking to focus on new education policy. Okay, so I think that is important to the one idea of education is enforcing to the all sectors of across the countries. Okay, so there is when we go deep rooted problem to facing, there is totally different actuality, different reality. So I think so we can think very differently to understand the language issue. Okay, I think yes.
Yeah, Mohit, do you have anything to add to that? Because you also mentioned that the reading literacy rate dropped, and this was just a simple line in Hindi. And like, if that is the case with something that's, very carefully saying this, as widespread as Hindi, then I'm assuming it would be far more difficult if when it comes to English, given the learning lag. Do you have anything to add to that? Mohit, we can't hear you properly.
So
Yeah, this is better. Yes, thank you.
whatever they're referring to it as it it harms marginalized children in both ways. So for one, the home languages that they are referring to are just the 22 official languages that are mentioned in the Schedule 8 of the Constitution, and so in that way it basically excludes all other dialects, all other languages that are not recognized, and we have like hundreds of those, right? So even say in Rajasthan, we have at least 4 or 5 dialects of Rajasthani language, and it's not even recognized. So those students will likely be homeschooled or schooled in Hindi, not because, since Rajasthan is not recognized at all. So they miss out on that because they have to pick up a language that they are not learning at home, and they also miss out on not learning English at a foundational stage in their childhood. And given that English is very, very necessary for social or economic mobility for children coming from the marginalized background, so it disadvantages them in that way as well. So because privileged children, when they come from home, or their homeschool language or whatever, they can catch up with English, right? They can get private tuitions, they can have educated parents, they can go to better schools, so on and so on. But children who are belonging to marginalized communities, who are poorer, who are Dalit, who are Bahujan, Adivasi, they cannot catch up, right? So in addition to learning, any given student, in addition to learning till fifth in a language that's not used in their home, they might also find themselves lagging behind in English. So this will basically keep English out of their reach, and will have significant negative effects going forward for the social and economic mobility. And this, in some ways, they are also trying to impose this homogeneous idea of India. Uh, you know, they're trying to prescribe these home languages. There's this push for, uh, you know, reading Indian myths in their original texts, and even not just in schools, even in college level and all that. So they're trying to push this, I would say, Brahminical idea of India by imposing Sanskrit and Indian myths and all these things upon children belonging to marginalized communities, which do not have much to do with this kind of an idea of India. So yeah, this whole NEP thing with push for English, push for home language, and push for idea, it seems like they're going for their old slogan of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. That's what I had to add on.
Yeah, and I was also wondering, perhaps Gunjan, you can take this regarding the language issue itself. That while they're privileging like a mother tongue or a home language in their foundational years, when they shift to like university level or undergraduate level, it's obviously there's a shift to English there again, and I'm wondering about like the problems that that it would imply for Bahujan students, because their English foundationally wouldn't be that strong then. So I'm assuming it would also deter their shift to pursue higher education. Could you shed a little bit of light on that implication?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And what Mohit and Akram have also pointed to, it makes a lot of sense that, um, and also in the context of who is this policy for, right? So who is this policy really talking for and recommending things for? My informed conjecture at this moment is that it's only talking about government schools and, poor kids. That's the assumption with which they operate. And this poor is a very umbrella kind of a term, which literally could mean anything. And they are not really going beyond this. And what I really think is that probably access to higher education may not be as much of a challenge for the Bahujan students, given the, keeping this language matter in mind, because, in terms of access, you have a lot of possibilities in higher education. It works differently at the access level, but at the experiential level, yes, there will be a lot of ramifications. If you don't know English, you will be left out of a lot of discourses in terms of access to reading material. There's a massive shortage of good reading material in Indian languages, even in Hindi, which you can see as one of the more promoted languages here in India. You would find that you don't get very good translations, you don't very good originally written material in Hindi, and there is a systematic also push from the policy space itself to prepare students to work in English. And so you have these two contradictory trends where you want to reap the benefits of the demographic dividend by and your strength happens to be of a large number of young people having certain English spoken skills in a certain way, and then your policy saying something else. We also need to see this recommendation of a policy in a larger context, a little larger context, in terms of what has been happening with the previous drafts of policies of this same policy. And there was a debate on the language matter because they give prominence to Hindi and also to Sanskrit in a certain way, and probably that issue hasn't settled till now within the policy document also, and even outside. So this point of mother tongue to me seems to be a way to tone down that kind of debate. This point has been there across policies, across acts, that we have mother tongue, but what is happening with that? We need to see this in a contemporary context. And post 1990s, with the liberalization reforms, economic reforms, neoliberalization reforms, whichever way you may want to look at it, the aspirations of people, particularly the marginalized groups, have changed. And if you are teaching English of a certain kind in public school, in government, in private schools, and you are not making any comment in terms of how private schools are going to function in your policy, what are the changes, what are the issues that are coming from there, and you're just making a policy statement in terms of mother tongue, and leaving that question, eliding that question of inequity and two worlds that these two languages, kind of two, it's more like a separation between these two worlds with vernacular and English. Till you address that question in your policy, you will not really be able to, make this connect with teaching mother tongue and creating better access for students from marginalized communities.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Keeping time in mind, let's move on to the next question. So I think this, I'm mostly going to direct to Akram and Mohit, but of course, Gunjan, you can also jump in. It's about the suggestion from the NMP to shut down public schools that have fewer than 30 students and merging these students with the nearest public school. I'm wondering how this deepens issues for intersectional students, such as Dalit girls or Dalit persons with disabilities, and even for tribal students who probably live in a lot of remote areas. Like how would this suggestion from the policy affect them? Akram, would you like to say something?
Right. Shutting down school has led to limited access for girls, especially because I am from the rural background, so I know very well what is a problem to girl to education or to getting proper education. So country like India, where diversity in every sect and part, so there is a the policy like public school fewer than 13 student and merging the student to nearest public school. So for the girl, I think a setback for the gender justice, actually, because girl has lack of traveling issues, lack of financial issues. So especially disadvantaged group, or what you say, underprivileged community, they are not interested to go to school and colleges which are long to their villages. So there is a important issue to understand in the context of gender justice. So I feel the issues of lack of traveling issues in villages, and lack of public school or private schools in nearby the bastis and mohallas. So there is a problem to especially in the context of girl and girl. Okay, so I think in my view there is a actually gender justice problem.
Yeah, adding to what Akram said about access issues and the issue of gender justice in it, I'll take a rather economic look at it from an economic perspective. So I see this as the tussle between equity and efficiency, right? So what the document basically states is that these schools with less than 30 children will be closed out because they are not efficient, or because they are not viable to run basically. So there comes this classic old debate between equity and efficiency in economics, right? So between the neoliberal or the more say socialistic model of development or education or public policy. So I think it's this uh, decision of closing schools less than 30 students, or along with some other uh, recommendations in the policy, is like a concerted push towards privatization or towards the neoliberalization of education in India, which wasn't uh, on such a large level until now, until this NEP. So I think that this is a push towards that, and it will bring about all the progress that we have made in access to education. So it might erase a lot of the progress that we have made. Uh, we have tried a lot of good policies towards access. Say in Bihar, they provided cycles to girls to have access to schools, and if you come go to say Tamil Nadu, they provide cycles, uniforms, textbooks, and they even provide laptops. So all of these incentives make sure that children go to schools and that they stay in school. There have been surveys and all that, and in parents in Tamil Nadu, they say that a lot of people basically dismiss say Tamil model of development or policy as just giving away freebies or doing things for votes and so on and so forth. But parents in Tamil Nadu tell that it's not about freebies. Having our child use a laptop or having our child, uh, say use cycles or have all these things is like a dream for them because they never thought that they could do it. So it is about restoring one's dignity is what people say there. So NEP's push for closing schools or its absolute silence on any incentives for making sure that children don't drop out or children enroll in schools. This I see it as a like concerted push towards neoliberalization of education, and this will obviously hurt girls more. This will hurt Dalit, Adivasi, or Bahujan people more. This will hurt poor people more because you cannot travel to a different village altogether if you do not have the means to access it. And again, Dalit women will lose out the most on this. So
Yeah, I think I want to take like a different perspective on this question with respect to teacher layoffs, because merging the schools would also mean that a lot of teachers would lose their jobs, and this also would come into play with the implication of merging Anganwadis with primary schooling, right? That there would be a lot of layoffs in that sense. So, Gunjan, could you talk a bit about that? Could you talk a bit about the implication that this would have on teachers, or just the pressure that it would have on teachers when it comes into this? Because alternatively, like the NEP also suggests hiring more teachers who are, from Bahujan and Adivasi backgrounds, but at the same time, through this merge and through the merge of Anganwadis and primary education, there is a lot of layoffs. So, could you please shed a little light on that?
Yeah, I think, building from what Mohit and Akram have said, that these school closures, if you do a GIS mapping of where schools are and with how many students do they have, you'll find that the schools located in most disadvantaged of the areas, villages are likely to get merged and shut down. So that, how you, in a spatial or a regional sense, how the funding goes is a major question. But one point that I like to say here is that even currently, when they are in a functional state and the schools are there, I don't think all schools have teachers in sufficient numbers to even do anything. So this policy by itself may be saying hiring more teachers, etc., etc. But we'll have to see that from at least 1986 onwards, whatever policy initiatives have happened, they've all said we'll hire teachers. But the right to education deadline for getting qualified teachers in place has been extended thrice over already, and the Right to Education Act has been amended. That was the first amendment in the RTE Act, that we can't provide teachers. So it's eliding literally, and the way the teaching community has been treated over the past, not by one government, but by all governments across India, across states. It has just broken the back of the practitioners who really want to make some change, who really come from marginalized communities, who had hopes to really do something good. And it has reduced the status of teaching as just a sort of a job naukri type of a thing. So people will just get into it for various reasons, not definitely for the love of profession and for changing things for children. They would just get into it and take it as a sort of stepping stage and move to the next level, or for other various reasons. So I don't think that what the policy is saying with regards to hiring teachers and all of that is going to be, they are going to be very serious about it. And Indian school system, even the higher education system, has a massive shortage of teachers. Recently, a study, and we've been saying this from past 10 years, that there's a shortage of 1 million teachers, school teachers in India. And to even come near to what RTE, Right to Education Act, is asking for, and I don't think any government has taken serious enough measures to hire qualified teachers. We are running on a para-teacher system where people who are not qualified as teachers are really teaching, and and I don't blame them for teaching in the schools, because they have their other compulsions. But the most disadvantaged of the schools get the least qualified of all teachers. So that's one major thing that we really need to see in terms of how the experience of the child shapes in a classroom context. And in a merged school, what are you expecting to happen? Delhi has had school mergers. It's not a village. It's not a sort of a small town kind of a space. And the how it has panned out inside the classrooms is actually very scary, where you see that you have multi-level classrooms. If you have to really adjust the student teacher ratio, you don't say one teacher per classroom, you say one teacher per X number of children, say 45 children. Now these 45 children can be in any number of classrooms. And if you work out, in a mathematical way, it actually leads to fewer teachers per classroom. So, and all of this has a ramification in terms of how the quality of education that the most, disadvantaged of all kids get in the schools. So, yeah. And why I'm bringing right to education again and again is because, what I find missing in the NEP is this rights perspective on education. It's just not there. And like Mohit also was saying that, looking at education only as a lever for economic growth and in a cost benefit sense is the sense that one get from this policy as a whole.
Sorry, go ahead, Mohit.
Getting to what Gunjan said about merging schools in Delhi, Niti Aayog also recommended the same one or 2 years ago through its program called Saath Hi. So basically, this program led to the merger of about 40,000 schools in MP, Jharkhand, and Odisha. And this program, activists argued that it went against the right to education because most of the schools that were closed were in tribal or hilly areas where access was limited already. And what basically then happened was a lot of schools closed, and there were severe impacts for this negative consequences were observed because of closing. More specifically, a lot of girls missed out on access to schools, and not just school, a lot of children also missed out on a very important part, that is the midday meals. So it could have also very well had a lot of nutritional issues as well going forward. So this has happened before, and now the NEP wants to do it on a pan-India basis. So we can only imagine the scale of the consequences going forward.
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment right now to remind the audience that you can drop your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll take them at the end of the session. Okay, moving ahead. Um, I think this is a very important aspect of this. This is a big change that the NEP has suggested, which is the academic bank of credits and the facilitation of multiple entries and exits with associated certification. How does that actually, let's merge this question with also the vocational aspect that the NEP has encouraged from classes 6 to 12, and of course the academic bank of credits. Like both of these things put together, what are the implications that it will have on Dalit students? Like, would it ultimately just end up being a replication of the Chaturvarna system, as children from marginalized castes will have, like, will mostly be will mostly opt for their ancestral occupations, like how you mentioned, Gunjan, in the start, that access to schools also means that they need to have realistic aspirations that the school will provide for them. So kind of putting these two together, the academic bank of credits within the higher education spectrum, and the idea of vocational training in the secondary schooling system, like what is the implication that it has on caste? And anyone can take this question up. Perhaps we'll start with Gunjan and then go ahead.
Yeah, I think, one really, when I saw this term, academic bank of credits first, Paulo Freire just came to my mind. And his whole work on pedagogy of the oppressed, and, how he critiques the banking concept of education. And here we have, a credit bank being set up where, you can deposit uh, something that you can transact, something that you can monetize. And this really does take us away from looking at what critical role education plays in the lives of Dalit students, women, LGBTQ. It's not just a means to get some sort of employment, whatever the global economy provides. It's also a critical tool for them to figure out where they are located, their position, their situation. And like you said, that where are they located in this spectrum of caste groups within India? What is their history? Is something that, and how a marginalization actually happens. Till you have that ability to think, till you have the worldview to look at things, I don't know what you'll do with all these things. So multiple entry and exit is probably the main thing through which academic bank of credits is being connected. And there are, of course, there are larger philosophical issues that I am talking about, but there are some very pragmatic issues that we are going to face in the class context, in the higher education context. So, like, it's a, now the policy is recommending that there will be a 4-year undergraduate system with multiple entries and multiple exits. So after first year of undergraduate degree, you can take some sort of a diploma, certificate kind of a thing and exit. You can deposit your credits in a bank, and you can come back and take those credits and add them to a fresh stock of credits. But you'll have to do it within a certain period of time. Right, all of this is fine, but imagine, what your 4th year of undergraduate degree would look like. There will only be very few students, those who really have the wherewithal to proceed through the entire system of education, and those who really need to be the most in the 4th year will be out first, right? So the most disadvantaged will go out first, because first the system is not catering to their needs, and they are not long enough in the system to assert their rights and change the system or make it respond in certain way. That is one. Second, there will be screening at each level. So you after 3 years, when you proceed to the 4th year, you will need to have a certain amount of CGPA. These are through the additional UGC guidelines that are now coming out. You will need a certain very high CGPA. So, you're again, making merit as a criteria for entry and exit to the highest of all levels, which again puts in certain degrees of questions. And I just want to really understand after say 1 year of say BA History Honors degree or even BSc Physics, what kind of a job would a person get? And why do you want the person to exit? Right. So my sense is that those who really, are not feeling okay in the system would exit, right, who don't really have the wherewithal. But in general, my own sense is that students themselves would stay for longer because they will not get jobs by exiting after 1 year or even after 2 years of undergraduate degree. I don't think the degrees equip them enough. So what is being done, what is being said is that there will be a higher education skills qualification framework of the kind that vocational education has. And there will be certain skill sets, certain outcomes that will be recommended for each stage. And these outcomes will be tied to job roles. And if you really see, this is literally vocationalization of the entire higher education system and nothing short of that. So you're reducing the whole liberal education system to something which is going to cater to specific jobs. If it's not catering to jobs, it will be phased out. So you won't have spaces to become scholars. You will not have spaces to really stay and engage with the issues that are socially relevant. So yeah, so that's what I think about it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mention it that way. That what kind of jobs would people get if they dropped out in like the first year or the second year? And it's interesting that you mentioned that because one of the questions that we had later on was how do employers or even like people who build career skills kind of adapt to this multiple exits and entries, like because the system wouldn't only change within the education sphere, but it would also change in the employment sphere. So could you also quickly just say something about that?
Yeah, I think we need to really see what has happened to vocational education in India first. And is it a popular avenue among students? Our survey in Delhi, we did a survey in 103 Delhi government schools with about 3,000 children. And what we found was that vocational education is not really a top priority that they would really like to go for. Even in among employers, they would like to hire anyone who has requisite skills, and that person needn't necessarily possess a particular degree.
Yeah.
So skilling through higher education has not really shown much benefit, even from a market economy point of view, because your market keeps changing constantly, and the programs, the way universities or any educational institutions function, it requires a certain stability. You can't have a program which is constantly changing, then it's no longer a program.
Yeah.
So, there's a contradiction in skilling, education for skilling. And, that concept hasn't really worked out very well in the Indian context. So I don't see this recommendation for the liberal studies panning out well at all. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Akram, could you talk a bit about the push to include vocational training from classes 6 to 12 and what that would mean?
Okay. Can I mention the previous point, because you are mentioning the primary school structure such as emerging in Anganwadis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Because I'm a son of Anganwadi worker. Okay, so I know how the system Anganwadi work in rural areas. Okay, I just mentioning the important point in regards to Anganwadi, because there are 14 lakhs Anganwadi centers in working in India. So Anganwadi worker work in different fields, different works, because we are just merging in school structure at Anganwadi, because the ICDS program, which is started in 1975, central government. So to merging preschool or foundation school Anganwadi is completely to against the ICDS program. Because the program is to combat child hunger and malnutrition issues. So to understand, the merging Anganwadis is completely against this project of ICDS. So I just remember the merging. So I don't have any further details about the Gunjan ma'am is saying.
Okay. Mohit, finally, could you please give us your insight into this?
A bit of a historical perspective. So, in the late 1950s, in about 757 or 58, C. Rajgopalachari in Madras tried to do something similar, and it was called the hereditary education policy, so, which basically proposed that students will go to schools in the morning, and in the afternoons they'll go and take up their ancestral professions, to provide students some vocational learning and all the other people who do that they are proposing right now. So that policy was a lot more direct than the NEP in its wording and its messaging and all that, because it directly said that students will go and take up the ancestral professions, which basically means the reinstatement of the caste system. So this policy received back then a lot of pushback by people, by activists, and most prominently from Periyar. He argued that uh, you know implementing this policy is like reinstating the Manu Dharma, is like reinstating the Chaturvarna, because and it was like a deliberate Brahminical ploy to keep Dalit children in their own professions and to keep the better jobs or better opportunities in society, economy for the upper caste children. And to be honest, I see this push for vocationalization in NEP in the same vein, because it says children have to take up vocational training, and the children that fail or they who cannot pass exams or who just opt for vocational training, they have to undergo this process. And like all of us know how social networks, the social capital, that determines what kind of jobs or what kind of internships and what kind of work that we have access to. So when you say that some of the children will have to go through vocational training, take a case of someone, say, in a rural area, son of a blacksmith, maybe. So what kind of vocational trainings will he have access to, right? Say, so the government says that you have to undergo this training to be, inducted back into the mainstream schooling. So all of us can. It's not hard to imagine what kind of vocational training he'll have access to, and once he starts getting into, once he or a lot of children like him get into their ancestral professions or the vocational training as it's being called, it's very much likely that those children never return to mainstream schooling, because once you've taken up work, once you started earning, and when you're struggling already, you do not have a lot of incentive to go back, right? And so this might also significantly increase dropout rates, especially for marginalized children. So I mean, yeah, so like this push for vocationalization instead of providing these vocational skills to children might end up hurting them more, and in addition to reinstating or this legitimizing this caste system or Chaturvarna system rather. Yeah.
Okay, great. We're like 15 minutes left. So let's take some questions from the audience before we do like a closing round. So Ajmer H had a question. It is, could the panelists shed some light on what does the NEP 2020 propose for students belonging from minority backgrounds, especially in the context of an increasingly saffronizing India? Are minority students even considered as a target group of concern akin to Dalit Adivasi students? And does the school survey have any findings regarding the impact of COVID lockdown on minority students? I think we can start with Mohit and then go to Akram and then Gunjan.
So as for the school survey, we could not find anything specific for minority children because we could not find a large enough sample. That's kind of a blind spot in a survey. As far as I know, there's obviously some anecdotal evidence and all that, but yeah, school survey itself could not find for the minority children. And as for the NAP doing something with minority children, So the NAP basically clubs all such groups together into SEDGs, right? Socially and economically disadvantaged groups, and that's the entirety of
Yeah.
affirmative action that's there in the NAP, right? It is silent on what kind of initiatives it plans to take, how it plans to say promote educational enrollment among marginalized groups, and there's absolute silence on any kind of a roadmap or methodology uh, in their approach. They have just clubbed together all these different groups together, and they say we'll do something for them, and that's that. But like all of us know that a Muslim boy is different from Dalit girl, right? You require different kind of approaches for different kinds of marginalization for for children to belong in different communities. So, but the NEP quite possibly in a deliberate attempt to derail any sort of progress that we made in terms of inclusion has clubbed all of these groups together, and yeah, well, it's completely silent on what it aims to, or how it aims to promote inclusion, especially for minority children.
Yeah, I think a little pointer that I'd like to mention for the audience over here is that when the NEP mentions socially and economically disadvantaged groups, it mentions Dalits, students from minorities, even women and all, like in one category. And it never kind of delineates and kind of addresses each of these marginalized groups separately. So that is definitely something that the audience should keep in mind. Akram, do you have something to add to that?
Okay, I think Mohit, you answer about because we couldn't find Muslim or minority student in our survey, and our focus in especially Palghar is, which is majority tribal populated district. So here is no minority or Muslim population is finding here. Okay, so we couldn't finding the Muslim samples here. So we are working is independently on the challenges of minority student on new education policies, but still we are just say because there is no data in our survey about Muslim minorities. So
Perhaps, Akram, you could also talk a bit about the sort of Hindutva agenda that it has, like this idea of saffronizing the education policy, and then we'll move on to Gunjan, if you have anything to add about that.
right. That is important point, like Hindutva agenda, because the fear in marginalized or Muslim youth or the younger generation, like person like me, which is dealing, because my own education is incomplete because of that type of fear. Okay, so we are continue our education in distance learning program. So that is a difficulty to the propaganda of Hindutva or suffragism in education system, because last since 2060 we all experience the campus issues in Indian universities. So there is a fear in hostels, there is fear in campus. So not only in classrooms, because we don't feel democratic atmosphere in not in classroom, as not in teachers or professors behavior, because lot of professor which is already propagating in classrooms as their own agendas in the name of Hindutva. They are teaching equality or equality like values, but actually they are propagating their own agenda. So we know we are expressing that type of teaching in university, as well as in my own observation, in my own schooling. Okay, so we can say there is actually the real issue, like NCERT books are changing the medieval history, which are dominating by Muslim rulers or Muslim regimes. The Hindutva propaganda is actually fabricated history to mention the what is the real history in the name of Hindutva. So I think this is a real challenge to the education system, to the actual constitutional values of education.
Yeah, and finally, Kunjan, do you have anything to add to that?
I think Mohit and Akram have said most of it. It's just that, the policy is silent about these critical questions of equity. And when something is, on your face and you can't shy away from giving a policy response to it and you just be silent, that silence also speaks volumes about, the just leaving things to the way they are. And in fact, ensuring that by not speaking, you just support what's going on. In terms of saffronization, you have to also look at how the policy talks about centralizing everything. Practically everything is being centralized and extremely. I don't think countries other than South Asian countries pay so much of attention to having a national education policy. It's a peculiar phenomena here, and it's also part of this project of nation building and national identity and all of that. And in the past few years in India, the question of nation and Hindutva have fudged in a very strange way. You just say nation and you are invoking a particular kind of a discourse. So if you just search for this policy, nation is used rampantly, and just a keyword search, you'll find a lot of nation mentions there. So these are not innocent mentions, I'd say, and they are very specific, context specific references that have been made. Though I don't say that the people sitting in the policy making, writing body would have had certain kind of interests, but we'll also have to see how policies come out through certain kinds of democratic pushes, pulls, and accords and compromises. So policy is seemingly silent, which is dangerous by itself, but if you read it in a context, it's not silent. It's making certain innuendos to this whole thing.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to the next question from the audience. Meena Dhanda had a question, which was if you could prioritize 3 demands that will meet some of the key criticisms you have made, what will you demand of the government? And since 3 were asked, let's go with 1 demand from each of the panelists. Let's start with Akram. Would you like to start? Yeah.
I think in my experience, there is not a single anti-caste training program in education institution in India. There are a lot of discrimination in campus, in classroom, because there is the concept of democratic education is not in university campus. So I think the anti-caste teacher program, training centers, or whatever we are dealing with the discrimination issues. Okay, so because we know the when in campus, when you told that you are not the right person to hear, to teach, or to learn in the campus, then you are already you are like demotivated to continue your education. So I think the anti-caste program or anti-caste training centers or training program, which is important in education system, which is new education policy. I think there is no mentioning in education policy of anti-caste program or anti-caste program training programs. So
and you'd suggest these training programs not just for teachers but for students also then?
Yes, right.
Okay. Thank you, Akram. Next, would Mohit like to answer?
The most important demands is universalization of education. Reinforce RT Act, make it a constitutional right for every citizen to have the right to education, right? Not just till 3rd or 5th or 6th, but they should have a right to education till at least till, I would say, higher secondary, right? Till 12th. And that would include, obviously, not shutting down schools in tribal areas, not shutting down schools with less than 30 children, and providing a lot of incentives and basically a robust roadmap for affirmative action for children. So I think the most important demand has to be, from my side, the universalization of education and like reinforcing the right to education.
Yeah, thank you. And Gunjan.
I think I'll extend what Mohit said a little and say that implement Article 21A of the Constitution in spirit. That article is based on Article 15. 21A is the Right to Education Amendment, in the Indian Constitution, which comes out from Article 21, which is Right to Life with Dignity. And 21A, in the drafting of that amendment, the courts, the judges, invoked Article 15 also, which is the article on caste, class, sex, distinctions, inequities, and they being unconstitutional. So I think even go beyond the Right to Education Act and implement that, whatever it takes to realize that 21A.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And lastly, we have a question from Alice Clark, and I think Mohit, you can answer this because it's very specific. The question is, would the harsh effects on marginalized groups, as mentioned, be higher in Maharashtra and lower in Tamil Nadu? Comparatively, I think, because you were part of the school survey, but then you've also mentioned Tamil Nadu.
Yeah, I think that would definitely be I cannot say for Maharashtra specifically, but they would be lower in Tamil Nadu, or they would be lower in say Kerala, or they would be lower in say a place like Himachal Pradesh. So it basically depends on what kind of social policy setup you have in a state. So say a state like Tamil Nadu, they have like robust programs, right? They have robust affirmative action policies. They have a good welfare system in place. So when you have a good functioning welfare state, the harsh consequences or the negative repercussions of a policy like NEP are supposed to be low, and if you also look at say the HDI parameters of states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, or Himachal Pradesh compared to say like Bihar or Jharkhand or Uttar Pradesh, there's a large disparity in them, and a lot of that has to do with the kind of social policy setup they have in their respective states, right? And which in turn has to do the kind of political movements, or what is the politics of a particular state. So yeah, so when you have a good welfare state, then the negative repercussions of such policies are supposed to be lower than places where you do not have such safety nets provided by the government.
Yeah, of course. I feel like we'll be running about like 5 minutes over time, but not more than that. So I hope the participants stay. We have one last question that was not answered, which was actually quite interesting. Asim Siddiqui had a question that, an important aspect of education for Dalit, Bahunjan and Adivasi students is to provide residential education, which was also a big casualty during the lockdown time. What do the panelists think about advocating on more residential education spaces for Dalit, Bahujan and Adivasi students? Let's try keeping the answer short, but perhaps Gunjan or Akram can take it.
I think, of course, there should be more residential spaces. That's, no doubt about it. But the strange thing is that the policy is also coming right in the bang in the middle of the COVID. Doesn't say anything about COVID and what ramification it has had for hostel students, especially the marginalized students in hostels. So, no doubt it should be promoted, but we'll have to really get the education system running on its feet again to be able to talk ahead of that. As of now, it's a major problem in terms of how do we actually get the system back again.
Yeah. Akram, do you have something short to add regarding residential schooling for Dalit, Bahujan and Adivasi students?
I think Gunjan ma'am covered all points.
Okay, great. So finally, just as a closing, if each one of you could, in short, like I know we've already discussed like the demands, but going ahead, the reality is that NEP is set to run and the momentum's picking up. So keeping that reality in mind, what are some remedies or some solutions that you would probably propose or some sort of cushioning that we can have to reduce the ramifications of the NEP. What are let's just keep it a little short and like again one per panelist. So let's start with Akram.
The remedies in my point of view, because we all know what to learn in all three education policies, okay, 1961, 86, 1986 and 2020. So then education policies say what to learn, but we don't know how to learn, okay, because a lot of material, lot of facilities, institutions already built in, because to deal with the actual issues in everyday life as well, social issues, we can't say it is helpful to the that type of education, okay. So the important important point is to how to mention in any education policy, to how to learn your to understand your holistic problem as your everyday problem, as you social, political or economic problem. So how to learn is, I think, is a center issue in education, and that is a remedies for all of us.
Yeah, I think that was very well framed. Yeah, Gunjan next.
Yeah, I think public action is the probably only way out of this whole thing, and the way centralization is happening generally in the Indian context and in education in particular. I think other than public response, there isn't much. And of course, you know, the hope that none of the policies has ever been implemented till now. 86 policy is still, you know, a lot of what it said is still, you know, there. So it's not a magic wand. So we need to really, as people, need to see it as, you know, made by people and not a given. It can be questioned. There are a lot of you know, gaps between what policy says and how it will be implemented, as has been the case across. So one has to find out ways to, you know, take a multimodal approach and, you know, intervene, find the areas where, you know, there are elbow spaces and one can push for, and alliances of practitioners, alliances of people, alliances of children, parents, students have to really, you know, think about what works, what is good for them, and take it ahead.
Yeah, and thank you. And finally, Mohit.
Gunjan, when she says we need more public action, and yeah, I do think that we need more public action. We need more research, action-oriented research from people, because that's what gets the ball rolling, right? I would say that the difference between a place like Tamil Nadu and Bihar is the level of public involvement or the level of public action in those two states. So if we are to mitigate the disastrous impacts that this policy could have, then I do think that something like we have to mobilize people, right? We have to educate people. We have to raise awareness about it, and all of these social. We have to gain a lot of political mobilization, right? So a lot of these people from different walks of life will have to come together and campaign and just basically try to force the government to roll back or dilute some of the proposals that they've made in the NEP. Yeah, I think that's probably the only way going forward, because I'm not really sure if polite dialogue would really work well in our favor here, given our past experiences.
Yeah, but okay, thank you so much. That was the end of our webinar on caste, COVID, and public education in India. Thank you to our panelists, Gunjan, Akram, and Mohit, who was supposed to be my co-moderator but ended up as a panelist. Despite the absence of Beena, I feel like this has been a very, very fruitful and holistic discussion. I remember when I started, researching and prepping for this session, I was like, wow, this is such a niche space, caste, COVID, and public education seems like a very niche intersection. But then the more I dived into it, the more I realized that it is not very niche. It's in fact very expansive and very structural that way. And I hope the audience has also taken it away that, the amount of external and internal implications that this will have going into the future and also at currently. So yeah, I think we're going to, and of course, thank you to INSAF India for hosting the webinar and making this happen. And thank you to our participants for sticking with us till the end and engaging with us and asking your questions. Yeah, I think we are going to take away from the session is to definitely try and create more public action, educate, agitate, and organize. Jai Bhim, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.